The grand ballroom of the National Veterans Honor Gala gleamed with chandeliers and polished marble floors. Uniforms sparkled with medals. Brass buttons caught the light. Laughter rolled across the room in waves, sharp, easy, proud. A string quartet played something soft in the background, but it was drowned out by the chatter of generals, congressmen, and decorated war heroes telling old stories with new exaggeration. Near the back of the room, almost against the wall, sat a woman who didn't quite fit in. Her name was Helen Thompson. She was in her mid-60s, dressed simply in a navy blue cardigan and long skirt. Her hands, weathered from decades of work, rested atop a brown leather purse that looked older than most people in the room. Inside was a folded photograph, edges frayed, its creases deep with time. No one greeted her when she walked in. No one offered her a drink or asked her story. A few noticed her. A few chuckled. One young lieutenant whispered to another, "Who invited someone's grandma?" They laughed into their glasses of champagne, then quickly moved toward a congressman. For a photo opportunity. Helen didn't mind. She hadn't come to be noticed. She scanned the room with quiet, watchful eyes. Her posture was still, not slouched but reserved, like someone who had learned to stay invisible in rooms full of loud, important people. The woman had presence, but not the kind people recognized right away. She sat still, as if waiting for something specific. Her eyes occasionally dropped to the photograph in her bag. The picture was black and white, faded but precious. A man in a military uniform smiled with a boyish charm. His name was David Thompson, and he was the reason she came. She hadn't seen him in over 50 years. The MC took the stage, tapping the microphone twice. The music faded, and the chatter softened into murmurs. "Ladies and gentlemen," he said, "thank you for joining us for this year's National Veterans Honor Gala. We're proud to welcome leaders, heroes, and families who've served this nation with courage and dignity. Tonight's keynote will be delivered by none other than General Marcus Reynolds." Applause thundered across the ballroom as the general approached the podium. Tall and sharp in his ceremonial dress, Helen glanced down at her hands. She clasped them together tightly. Her knuckles turned white. She remembered seeing Reynolds once on TV years ago, a rising star in the Army, one of the youngest 4-star generals in recent history. She had no idea if he remembered her, or if he even knew she'd been invited. She hadn't expected a spotlight. She just wanted to witness the moment, to hear what he had to say about honor and service and the people behind the uniforms. General Reynolds cleared his throat and looked over the crowd. "Tonight," he began, "I was expected to deliver a speech about leadership, tradition, and the legacy of American service. And I'll get to that. But first, He paused. The room quieted. Forks were set down on plates. People leaned forward. "I want to begin with a name. A name many of you don't know. But you should." Helen froze. The general's eyes scanned the crowd until they settled squarely on the woman in the corner. "Her name," he said slowly, "is Helen Thompson." Gasps, confused murmurs. All heads turned. Some of the same officers who had laughed earlier looked stunned, suddenly unsure of themselves. Their bodies shifted in their seats. One lieutenant lowered his gaze. Clearly ashamed, Helen sat motionless. Eyes wide, her heart thumped in her chest like a drum. She hadn't spoken to Reynolds in over a decade. How did he? "When I was a young captain," the general continued, "I lost my older brother in Vietnam. Mia, the Army gave up. My family was told to move on. But this woman, this ordinary, quiet woman, never stopped searching. Not for her husband. Not for anyone's. She found families. She found truth. She found closure. Now, there was no laughter. No clinking glasses. Just silence. Deep, thick silence. She was a nurse, a wife, a widow, a warrior of a different kind. The kind who fights without weapons or ranks, but with letters and calls and heart. Because of her, I got to bury my brother. I got to say goodbye. Helen felt something warm roll down her cheek. The general stepped away from the podium. "Please stand," he said, "and honor her." Chairs scraped backward. The room rose to its feet. Everyone clapped. Some wiped tears. Others looked ashamed of their earlier indifference. Helen remained seated, overwhelmed. Her hands trembled in her lap. She hadn't wanted this. But the general walked toward her, eyes filled with gratitude. And in that moment, the laughter that once filled the room was gone, replaced by something deeper, something heavier, something more real. It was 1972, and the Kansas sun hung low in the sky, casting long shadows across the front porch of a modest farmhouse. Helen Thompson stood barefoot, her apron still dusted with flour, waving to the army truck as it rumbled down the dirt road. Her husband, David, leaned out the back, one hand gripping the side rail, the other waving back with a grin that could melt steel. "I'll be home before the leaves fall," he had shouted, but the seasons changed. And David didn't come back. 3 months later, a telegram arrived. "Missing in action. Vietnam. No explanation. No details. Just a stamped notice of a shattered life." Helen didn't cry at first. She read the letter over and over again, sitting in the kitchen, the pie she'd been baking now forgotten in the oven, until the smell of burnt crust filled the air. The sound of the ticking wall clock was deafening. Each second passed like a blow to the chest. She refused to believe he was gone. Everyone else moved on. Her neighbors, her church, even David's family slowly began to accept the reality. "He probably didn't make it, Helen," they'd whisper gently. "You need to live your life." But Helen wasn't built that way. Instead, she poured her grief into action. She enrolled in nursing school at the local community college. By day, she studied. By night, she wrote letters to the Department of Defense, to military contacts, to senators, anyone who might offer answers. When she graduated, she took a job at the local VA hospital. It was a sterile, brutal place, men missing limbs, vision, sanity. But Helen never flinched. She listened to their stories. She wiped blood and tears with the same gentle hands she once used to smooth. David's caller before church. Her patients noticed something different about her. She never pitied them, never patronized. She treated every one of them like they mattered, even the ones society had forgotten. That's how she met Sergeant Luis Mendoza. He came in one rainy night with a shattered leg, and nightmares that made him scream through the halls. Helen sat with him, quietly, until he calmed. When he finally spoke, he told her about a unit ambushed deep in the jungle. A name slipped out. David Thompson. Helen leaned in. "You saw him?" Louise nodded, uncertain. "I think so. We were in the same firebase, maybe for a week. Then he was gone." That sliver of hope was all she needed. She doubled her efforts. She started logging testimonies. She traveled to Army reunions, tape recorder in hand, listening to the scattered, haunted memories of men who had been there. She started connecting dots the Pentagon hadn't bothered with. And still, she wrote letters. She became known in quiet circles, POW MIA advocacy groups that operated out of kitchens and basements, filled with people like her, desperate for answers, tired of silence. They didn't wear uniforms, but they fought just as hard. Years passed. Helen never remarried. She wore her wedding ring every day. She didn't call herself a widow. In her mind, David was still out there somewhere. Alive, maybe. But even if he wasn't, she needed to know. In 1981, she received a faded photograph from a friend in Hanoi. It showed a man standing behind a fence, lean, bearded, and looking. directly into the camera. The eyes. They were David's eyes. She was sure. She sent it to the army for analysis. They told her it was inconclusive. She didn't stop. She flew to Washington on her own dime, stood in the offices of senators, secretaries, and suits who told her, "Mom, we appreciate your passion, but this isn't a priority right now." Then, she'd open her purse, unfold the photograph, and tell them everything. She wasn't loud, but she was relentless. She gathered signatures, led candlelight vigils, and sat on the advisory board for families of the missing. Still, she never gave a single press interview. "I'm not the story," she'd say. "David is, and so are the rest." At the VA hospital, younger nurses called her a legend. Soldiers came to her with questions they couldn't ask anyone else. She listened, always listened. She grew older, but her fire never dimmed. One December evening, as snow blanketed her Kansas town, Helen lit a single candle in her window, the same she lit every year on the day David left. She sat with her cup of tea, staring at the flame, remembering his voice, his hands, his laugh. She could still hear him. He was 23 when he vanished, and she had spent over 3 decades trying to bring him home. But her mission had grown. She wasn't just searching for her husband anymore. She was searching for the truth, for hundreds like him. And she had become the quiet force behind real change. She'd written over 8,000 letters, helped over 70 families find closure, tracked down remains, pressured investigations. All while working shifts in a hospital most people couldn't last a year in. Helen Thompson was no ordinary woman. She was something else entirely, and the world would soon learn just how powerful a simple, determined heart could be. In the eyes of the military world, Helen Thompson remained anonymous. She had no uniform, no official title, no rank. But to those who worked behind the scenes, especially in the POW MIA network, her name carried quiet power. By the early 1990s, Helen was known in military archives and back offices as the Kansas Lady. Her letters were so detailed, so persistent, and so logically argued that even career officers couldn't ignore them. She referenced jungle coordinates, unit logs, chopper manifests, and even weather reports on the days certain patrols had gone missing. She wasn't guessing. She was tracking carefully. More than once, officials opened letters from her that listed errors in their own databases. One particularly high-ranking colonel once slammed her file shut and muttered, "She's better at this than half my team." But he kept her letters. So did many others. She'd become a researcher, a historian, and a detective all at once. She could recite soldier ID numbers and map regions of Laos like she'd lived there. Every time she helped a family find remains, she'd quietly send flowers to the funeral, never revealing she was the reason their son or husband had finally come home. And still, no one outside those circles really knew who she was. Helen never attended galas. She avoided interviews. She didn't want awards. What she wanted, what she demanded, was accountability. Her work eventually reached the ears of investigative journalist Kyle Brenner, a war correspondent turned documentarian. When he visited Helen's home in Kansas in 1996, he expected to find a tough-talking veteran type. Instead, he found a quiet woman in a cardigan serving him warm apple pie and black coffee. He noticed her walls were covered in maps, old photos, and red-pinned timelines. She had binders labeled with names, dates, and military case numbers. Brenner was stunned. "You've built a national-level investigation out of your living room." Helen smiled faintly. "I just couldn't sit still." His eventual documentary, Forgotten, Not Lost, briefly mentioned Helen's role. But by her request, she wasn't the focus. "The soldiers are," she insisted. Yet her influence couldn't be ignored. Congress members began contacting her for insight. Her data helped spark a reorganization of how the Department of Defense handled MIA cases. In 1999, one congressman from Illinois introduced a bill requiring more transparency in POW MIA investigations. In his speech to the House, he said plainly, "I owe this legislation to a woman from Kansas who won't stop writing me letters." Still, Helen stayed quiet. She sent him a thank you card and went back to work. Her biggest breakthrough came in 2001, when she uncovered a military log error that had misfiled 5 missing Marines from the same unit. She connected it to a crashed Huey helicopter found deep in a Laotian valley. Her theory: they had died in that crash, not on the patrol as previously thought. She sent her evidence to an old contact at Joint POW MIA Accounting Command, JPAC, who took a chance and reopened the file. Months later, remains were confirmed. Families were notified. At the service of one of those Marines, a weeping mother clutched Helen's hands and whispered, "I can finally sleep again." Helen didn't cry, but her eyes held years of grief and grace. By then, veterans groups had caught on. The Vietnam Veterans of America invited her to speak, but she declined. Instead, she sent a letter to be read aloud. It said, "I never wore a uniform, but I served beside every one of you. I will continue serving until every name has a homecoming." It was read to a silent audience. Some veterans stood. Others saluted. Helen continued her work into her 60s. She'd rise before dawn, read case files over coffee, and take long walks before calling families. She had learned how to speak with grieving mothers, confused sons, or stubborn uncles who never gave up hope. Her voice gentle, strong, unwavering, was their anchor. Her house became a safe haven. Soldiers and widows alike came to visit. She didn't keep trophies or medals, but she did keep every thank you note ever sent to her, stacked neatly in a shoebox beside her nightstand. In 2005, she received a letter with no return address. Inside was a photo of a smiling young man in uniform and a short note, "Because of you, I came home." She never found out who sent it, yet the note stayed tucked in her Bible, next to David's photograph. There were days when the work took its toll emotionally, physically, spiritually. Days where the weight of other people's pain pressed on her like stone. But she reminded herself that every case was someone's child, someone's father, someone like David. And deep down, she knew if it wasn't her, who would do it? One evening, she sat by the window watching snow fall again, candle flickering like it had every December. Her neighbor's son, newly enlisted, came by to check on her. He asked her, "Why do you still keep doing this after all these years?" Helen looked at him, eyes tired but kind. "Because promises don't expire," she said, and with that, she opened another file. Another story. Another name. Another soldier still waiting to come home. Back in the grand ballroom, the air had shifted. The scent of roast beef and expensive perfume still lingered, but now something else filled the space stillness. All eyes turned to the podium, where General Marcus Reynolds, in his full dress uniform, stood silently, gripping the edges of the lectern. The room filled with generals, colonels, senators, journalists, and young officers hungry for status, leaned forward. He wasn't reading from the prepared speech on the teleprompter. He wasn't talking about policy, strategy, or the future of the armed forces. No one knew where this was going, until he said her name, Helen Thompson. The sound sliced through the room like a command. In the far corner, Helen blinked. Her name echoed back at her through dozens of mouths whispering, "Who?" The murmuring rippled across the polished floor. A few heads turned her way. Others frowned, trying to remember if they had heard the name before, but General Reynolds didn't wait for recognition. When I was a young captain, he said, voice steadier now, my family was torn apart by silence. My older brother, Lieutenant Daniel Reynolds, went missing in Vietnam in 1971. No one knew what happened. The Army told us to prepare for the worst. My mother spent the rest of her life praying by a window. My father drank himself to death. Reynolds paused. The weight of that memory pressed visibly into his shoulders. I was just a boy when he disappeared. But by the time I joined the Army, I had already buried my entire family, except for my brother, because he was never found. And in the eyes of the government, that was the end of it. A hush fell again. Several people dropped their gaze to their tables. One older woman clutched her necklace. A man in uniform coughed awkwardly. General Reynolds's voice grew firmer. But it wasn't the end. Because one woman who didn't know me, didn't know my family, and wasn't even on the payroll, she kept looking. He raised a hand, pointed across the room. That woman is sitting in this room right now. She is the reason I got to bury my brother with honor. She is the reason my brother's name is not just etched in stone, but written in our family's hearts again. Helen Thompson found Daniel. Gasps filled the room. Several heads turned to Helen, who sat frozen, as if the walls had vanished, and every eye in the world was now on her. She never asked for a thing, he continued. She didn't charge a fee. She didn't want a photo op. She didn't even sign the report that led to the discovery of my brother's remains. I only found out because an officer in JPAC told me a civilian researcher had flagged a discrepancy in the unit logs. When I asked who, he said, some lady from Kansas. Reynolds gave a sad, almost amused smile. That some lady had pieced together a puzzle that a room full of trained analysts missed. And not just for my brother, for dozens of families. Maybe hundreds. A reporter in the back quietly raised a camera. The flash went off. Helen winced. She was visibly uncomfortable with the attention. The general noticed. I know she doesn't want this spotlight, he said gently. She's probably furious at me right now. But some people deserve to be honored, whether they like it or not. That earned a few soft chuckles, but respectful ones. The general stepped down from the podium, walked through the tables without hesitation, and approached Helen directly. Officers shifted to give him space. All eyes followed him. When he reached her, he extended his hand. She slowly rose, confused, heart pounding. He didn't make her walk to the stage. He came to her. Double quotes, Mrs. Thompson, he said, voice thick with emotion. On behalf of every soldier you found, every family you've helped, and every officer who failed to do what you did, thank you. He reached into his coat pocket and pulled out a velvet box. Inside was a polished medal, the Distinguished Civilian Service Award, one of the highest honors given to a civilian by the Department of Defense. I requested this myself, he said. I know you've refused awards before, but this one already has your name on it. Her lips quivered. She looked down at the medal, then back at the general. I don't deserve this, she whispered. Yes, he said, lowering his voice so only she could hear. You do. You earned more than I ever did. A single tear escaped her eye as she accepted the box with trembling hands. Then something incredible happened. The entire ballroom, led by the general, rose to their feet. The applause began slowly. Then it thundered. A sound so powerful it shook the chandeliers. Veterans stood shoulder to shoulder with politicians. Soldiers stood shoulder to shoulder with journalists. And every single one of them applauded her. No rank, no title, no uniform, just a name. A name that had once been whispered in the backrooms of Washington, but was now echoing off the marble walls of Power. Helen Thompson. A woman whose strength had never come from a podium, but from the quiet resolve to never stop searching, Never stop writing, never stop believing. And in that moment, every laugh, every snide whisper, every dismissive glance she had ever endured, was silenced by a room full of reverence. The thunder of applause rolled across the ballroom like a wave crashing against stone, loud, relentless, and unignorable. For a moment, Helen Thompson stood in its center breathless, the metal box still cradled in her hands, like it might disappear. If she blinked, she had never dreamed of this, not the stage, not the standing ovation, and certainly not the way hundreds of people looked at her now with a mix of reverence and remorse. It was the young officers who stood tallest, the same ones who had snickered earlier in the evening. Their faces were now red not with laughter, but with shame. One of them, barely 30, mouthed a quiet, "I'm sorry," in her direction. She gave a small nod, forgiving without needing words. That was Helen's dignity without pride, strength without arrogance. General Reynolds took a step back, giving her space. Helen wasn't a speaker. She hadn't spoken into a microphone since her high school graduation in 1965. Her voice wasn't commanding, wasn't loud, but when she opened her mouth, the entire room leaned in. The applause faded until silence returned, hanging in the air like reverence in a cathedral. "I don't know what to say," she began softly. "This wasn't supposed to be about me." Some chuckled gently. She held up the metal box, her voice trembling only slightly. "This, this belongs to every wife who waited by a phone that never rang, every mother who sat by the window, every father who kept the porch light on. I'm just one of them. I just didn't stop." There was a pause, a sharp, aching pause. "I wrote letters. I asked questions. I pushed. Not because I was brave, but because I couldn't sleep at night, knowing that someone's son might still be out there in a jungle. No one wanted to talk about anymore. I had to believe that someone still cared. I had to be that someone." The room was still as stone. She continued. "I didn't find my husband. Not yet. But in the process of searching for David. I found hundreds of others. And I made a promise to myself. I wouldn't rest until every name had a story. Every grave had a marker. Every family had peace." A senator seated near the stage wiped a tear with the corner of his napkin. An elderly veteran in a wheelchair bowed his head in silent gratitude. Helen's voice grew steadier, as if strengthened by the spirits of those she'd served. "If you remember anything tonight, let it be this: service doesn't always wear a uniform. Sometimes it comes in the form of stubbornness and stacks of letters, and showing up even when no one invites you." She gave a gentle smile, then sat back down. For a few seconds, no one moved. It wasn't hesitation, it was reverence. Then came the applause again, not thunderous this time, but long, warm, and respectful. The kind of applause that says thank you, and we see you now. As Helen settled back into her seat, the general leaned over and whispered, "You just taught them more about service in 5 minutes than I could in 20 years. Helen replied, "You did the hard part. You listened." After the speeches resumed, people kept glancing toward Helen. Some reporters approached, but she gently waved them off. "Tonight isn't about a story," she told one. "It's about the names we don't speak enough." Still, the cameras had already captured it all: the general's speech, the standing ovation, her quiet humility. By the time she returned to her hotel room, her phone buzzed with a dozen unread messages. Family, old friends, even military contacts she hadn't heard from in years were reaching out. She ignored most of them that night. Instead, she turned off the light, sat by the window, and pulled David's photo from her purse. The black and white picture had aged. The fold lines were deep now, but David's smile, youthful and full of hope, remained unchanged. "I didn't stop," she whispered. "I told you I wouldn't." She didn't cry. She never cried for herself. But in that quiet moment, she allowed her eyes to well not with sorrow, but with a soft, exhausted kind of peace. Downstairs in the hotel lobby, attendees were still buzzing about her. "Why haven't we heard of her before?" one officer asked. "Someone like that should be teaching at West Point." Another veteran said, "She reminded me why I joined. I almost forgot." The general gave one interview before leaving for the night. When asked why he dedicated his speech to Helen Thompson, he said simply, "Because sometimes the greatest service isn't done on the battlefield, but in the silence after the war, when everyone else forgets and someone chooses to remember." The quote would be printed in papers the next morning. But Helen wouldn't read them. She didn't need headlines. She had David. She had the work. She had one more name to find, one more family to call, one more promise to keep. And as the city slept, Helen Thompson sat beside her candlelit window, metal box resting unopened. Beside her, not for the glory, never for the glory, but for the quiet return of those who never made it home, and the vow that they never be forgotten. By sunrise, Helen's name was everywhere. The Washington Post ran the headline, "A hero without rank, the woman who silenced the room." CNN called her the nation's quiet conscience. A viral video clip just 38 seconds long captured the moment General Reynolds stepped down from the stage and walked toward Helen's table. The applause, her stunned face, the medal in her hands, everything about it stirred something deep across the nation. For the first time in her life, Helen Thompson couldn't hide in quiet corners anymore. She awoke to dozens of voicemails, some from journalists, others from military families who simply said, "Thank you." The phone rang continuously until she unplugged it. Then the doorbell started. Reporters, neighbors, a high school girl from Wichita who wanted to write a school essay about her. Helen didn't know how to respond. She wasn't used to attention. The only spotlight she ever cared about was the one she held over a soldier's case file at 2 a.m. in her kitchen. This was different. This was noise. But it wasn't all noise. By the end of the week, her old mailbox was stuffed with envelopes. Letters from soldiers, mothers, sisters, veterans. They came from every state, some handwritten with shaking hands, others typed by younger relatives of men who never made it home. One read, "My father was one of the Marines you found. We never knew who was behind it until now. I hope you know what you've given us." Another said, "Because of your work, my grandfather finally visited his son's grave before he died. He cried for the first time in 30 years. Helen read every single one. Then she folded each with care and added them to a new shoebox. She labeled it in small, neat letters. After the gala. A few days later, an invitation arrived in an official Department of Defense envelope. They wanted to fly her to Washington. Again this time, to formally present her with the Presidential Medal of Freedom. Helen stared at the letter in disbelief. She placed it on her coffee table and left it there for 3 days without answering. The medal meant something, sure. But it wasn't why she started any of this. She sat by the window, candle burning low, and stared out at the snow-dusted road. Her neighbor, young Private Jacob Manning, knocked on her door that evening with a smile and an old Army canteen. "Found this at a surplus sale," he said. "Figured it might remind you of someone." She chuckled. "Reminds me of about 50. Someone's," he grinned. "Everyone's talking about you, you know." Helen shook her head. "I know, and I wish they'd stop." "But you inspired people," Jacob insisted. "Even me. I was starting to think service didn't mean anything anymore." Not until that night. Helen studied him for a moment, then softened. "You know what it really means, Jacob? It means doing what's right when no one's watching, when no one's clapping. That's the real part." He nodded slowly, letting it settle. The next morning, Helen finally called the number on the invitation. She declined the ceremony, politely, firmly. "I'm honored," she said, "but I'm needed here. There's more work to do." Still, the recognition didn't stop. Veterans organizations began naming buildings after her libraries, resource centers, even a wing at the VA hospital in Topeka. A college offered her an honorary doctorate. Military historians requested interviews. For documentaries, Helen refused most. Not out of rudeness, but because the phone calls and camera crews got in the way of the work. She kept her kitchen table just the same, papers stacked, case files open, her old magnifying glass nearby. The photo of David remained at the center. She'd glance at it between tasks, sometimes smiling, sometimes whispering to it as if he'd walked in from the cold. One morning, she received a small square envelope with no return address. Inside was a grainy photograph of a Vietnamese jungle village. On the back, a handwritten note. "I buried him there, 1972. I couldn't carry him out. I'm sorry." Helen's fingers trembled. Her heart beat slow and heavy. There was no name. On the note, no coordinates. But it was a start. She made tea, pulled out her map, marked a spot she'd been unsure of for years, and began again. News outlets wondered what happened to her, why she disappeared after the gala. One even published a story titled, "The Mystery of Helen Thompson. Where is she now?" Read that one with a smile. If they only knew. She wasn't hiding. She was hunting. Still, one case at a time, one name at a time. Families continued to write her. Some came to visit, placing flowers under her mailbox or candles by her gate. Helen never made a spectacle of it. She always thanked them kindly, then returned to her files. Her life hadn't changed. Only the world around her had finally opened its eyes. In a follow-up interview, General Reynolds was asked what he thought about Helen refusing the presidential medal. He replied without hesitation, "She already has the only reward she ever wanted. The truth." That quote would be etched onto a plaque outside the newly renamed Thompson Center for POW MIA Research in D.C. But Helen never visited. She didn't need to see her name on walls. She only needed to see one name, just one, David Thompson on a gravestone, confirmed and complete. And until that happened, she kept her light on, her pen ready, and her heart wide open, because Helen knew the work wasn't over yet. Winter turned to spring, and Helen's candle still burned every night by her window. Kansas winds whistled through the fields, and the countryside bloomed, but inside her house, the air stayed heavy with memory. She was 81 now. Her hands ached when she wrote. Her legs stiffened when she stood. But her mind? Sharper than ever. Her latest project involved tracking down a small group of soldiers, last seen near Quang Tro, in 72 men whose disappearance never made headlines. Their families had given up hope decades ago. But not Helen. She had a new lead. A retired North Vietnamese soldier living in Thailand had started talking rumors passed to an NGO, then filtered to one of Helen's contacts. He described an American POW who taught English to local children in a jungle village after escaping a prison camp. The description was vague, tall, southern accent. Always said he had a wife who baked cherry pies. Helen froze at those words. Cherry pie. She had made David one every Sunday, even the week before he deployed. "I'll ask you about that pie every night I'm gone," he'd joke before leaving. "So you'd better remember how to make it." That lead took weeks to verify. She contacted translators, made phone calls at odd hours, begged favors from field researchers and war archivists. Every time the trail went cold, she lit her candle again and whispered, "We're not done, David. Not yet." Then it happened. A package arrived from Thailand. Inside was an old American dog tag. Rusted, scratched, David Thompson O. Paws U.S. Army. Choli Sealand's knees nearly gave out. She clutched it to her chest and sobbed harder than she had in years, not from grief, but from the sudden weight of hope returning. The impossible dream she'd carried for decades was no longer just hers. Called the Army. This time, they didn't stall. They sent a team. DNA was collected. Forensic analysts dispatched. After 45 years of Helen pushing against closed doors, the doors had finally opened. 3 weeks later, the Army called back. Partial remains had been found near the pond. Very village described in the letter. The DNA from the tag matched the Thompson family line. It wasn't everything, but it was enough. David was coming home. When the plane arrived, Helen stood on the tarmac with her hand over her heart, flanked by 2 Army officers in full dress uniform. There was no grand speech, no cameras, just a folded flag, a polished wooden box, and the quiet hum of reverence that filled the air. She didn't cry, not in public. She stood straight, proud, her frame thin but unshaken. When the officers saluted, she nodded in return. Then she whispered, "You came back to me." The funeral was held on a bright June morning. Dozens of veterans Helen had helped over the years came from all over the country. Some brought their children. Some came in wheelchairs. A few leaned on canes or each other. The cemetery was silent as the bugle played taps. Helen placed a cherry pie on the grave. "Like I promised," she whispered. That night, she returned home alone. The candle still burned in the window, as it always had. But this time, she let it flicker out before dawn. For the first time in her life, the wait was over. She walked to the fireplace, carrying a box she hadn't touched in years. Inside were dozens of unsent letters to David, letters she'd written through the decades. Birthdays missed, anniversaries marked, news about the farm, stories about the soldiers she helped. All those words she couldn't say, saved on yellowing paper. She opened the first one. Dated Christmas 1974. The house is quiet again. The tree is smaller this year. I made your pie anyway. I always do. I still wear your dog tags when I sleep. Is that strange? She read several more. Her voice shook, her eyes blurred. Finally, she fed them, one by one, into the fireplace. Watched the paper curl and blacken. Not because she wanted to forget, but because she was ready to rest. The last letter burned slowly. When it was done, she whispered into the embers, "Thank you for waiting for me, too." The next day, Helen sat outside on her porch with a cup of coffee and watched the sunrise. No maps, no folders, no timelines. Just the morning, pure and still. For the first time in 5 decades, she had nothing to chase. And yet, her name lived. On veterans' families still wrote her, asking for guidance. Young researchers visited her home, eager to hear her methods. Documentaries aired on national television. Schools taught her story. A scholarship in David's name sent underprivileged kids to college. She didn't ask for any of it, but she accepted it with grace. Helen didn't believe in saints. She believed in effort, in showing up, in doing what others wouldn't. And the world finally saw that quiet heroism. Years passed. The seasons rolled across Kansas in golden waves, and Helen Thompson aged gracefully with them. Her hair turned snowy white. Her step slowed. But her presence, strong, grounded, and deeply respected, remained a pillar in her community. Though she had stopped taking on new cases, she continued mentoring others. Every Tuesday afternoon, students, researchers, and veterans gathered around her kitchen table. She told stories, not just of the war, but of persistence, humanity, and how the truth, however long buried, always wanted to be found. She kept the shoebox of letters, the ones from soldiers' families and the ones she received after the gale in a glass case beside David's flag. Visitors often paused before it, reading carefully, sometimes in tears. One winter, she received an invitation from Arlington National Cemetery. They were organizing a commemorative wall for civilian contributors to the nation's defense efforts, those who had no medals, no titles, but whose sacrifices helped reshape the landscape of military history. Helen declined, as she always did. She said walls were for remembering others, not herself. But when she turned 90, something changed. She knew time was running short. Her body was tired. Her eyes, once so sharp over maps and records, now strained even with glasses. One morning, as she watched the sunrise paint the sky in orange and rose, she whispered to the wind, "I think I've done enough." That spring, her health began to decline quickly. When neighbors found her struggling with the stairs, they took turns helping her. Jacob Manning, now a decorated Army captain, visited weekly. He brought groceries, read her the latest news, and updated her on military reforms inspired by her advocacy. "You've changed how they treat us," he once said. "You made it personal again." Helen smiled. It was always personal. By the time her 91st birthday arrived, the little farmhouse was surrounded by bouquets, letters, and flags. Dozens of veterans came by that week. Some drove hundreds of miles just to say thank you. One man knelt in her yard and cried. He had been listed as Mia until she found a photo of him in a POW camp proof he'd been alive. That discovery changed his entire military record and gave him access to medical care he'd been denied for years. "You saved my life twice," he said. Helen touched his hand gently. "I only held the lantern. You walked out of the dark yourself." A few weeks later, Helen passed away quietly in her sleep. She was buried next to David, under a weeping willow tree she had planted herself when the Army returned his remains. Entire town attended the funeral. So did veterans, generals, politicians, students, and ordinary people touched by her work. No cameras, no speeches, just silence. A silence so deep, so sacred, it felt like the world was holding its breath to honor her. At the end of the service, a young girl stepped forward, barely 12, with freckles and a voice full of courage. She read from a paper she had written. They laughed when the general paused at her name. They didn't know her, but now we do. And we will never forget the woman who taught the world that truth doesn't need a microphone. It only needs a heart that refuses to give up. The final line was met with stillness, then quiet tears. Helen's home was turned into a small memorial center. Not a museum. Helen would have hated that, but a working space where students and researchers continued the work she began. The kitchen table remained untouched, the candle on the windowsill replaced by a soft electric lamp it stayed on every night. Veterans called it the light for the lost. In the years that followed, her story became required reading at West Point. Her methods were studied in intelligence units. Her name became synonymous with integrity and tireless compassion. A decade later, a statue was unveiled in Arlington, not of Helen alone, but of a civilian woman at a desk, reading a letter by candlelight. Behind her, on the wall, the names of the soldiers she helped bring home. No plaque explained who she was. Just one line was carved into the base. She found the fallen and helped us all stand taller. Every year, on the anniversary of her death, someone left a cherry pie on her grave. No one ever saw who did it, but everyone understood why. Helen Thompson's story didn't end when she closed her final file. It echoed in every folded flag given to a family, in every soldier's name cleared, and in every person who chose, like her, to stand quietly in the shadows doing the work. No one else would. She never sought applause, but the world clapped anyway. Because, in a room full of uniforms and medals, it was a simple woman's name, a name spoken by a general that silenced the laughter and reminded a nation of what real honor looks like. And in that silence, a new kind of hero was born. Not the kind who wore a badge, but the kind who lit the way. The end.